Hello class, welcome to another video. I hope you all are doing well under these interesting circumstances that we're in right now. I've had a few requests for some more material on manual exposure and how to go about that with your cameras. So it's not a requirement, but for those of you who have cameras that are capable of operating in manual mode, I definitely recommend try this out. So some of this material we've talked about in class before. I thought it would be good to review some of it and then go back and using the Camera Simulator website, we'll look at some situations where we will put this into practice. So let's get started. A classic way to visualize the variables that we have to deal with when exposing your photographs manually would be the exposure triangle. Which, as you might guess, means that there's three main variables that we have to deal with. The first one is ISO, second one is aperture, and the third is shutter speed. With a film camera, once you buy your film, it comes with a set ISO, and once you put that roll of film in your camera, you have basically set your ISO and you're not really thinking about it anymore. With digital cameras, we can change it from shot to shot. So that's something that can potentially always be in play. Something to keep in mind that will help us to prioritize which settings we change and how we change them would be to remember and understand what visual artifact is created by changes to each setting. So aperture has its own artifacts that you can see in the image. Shutter speed has things that it will do to the image, and with ISO it has its artifacts it will leave. In this case, with the higher the ISO, you'll get more noise in a digital camera, and with film, the higher the ISO film, you'll have more grain. The trade-off for that is that the higher the ISO, the more sensitive it is to light, so you can make an image with less light. So low light situations, when it's darker, you tend to go to a higher ISO so that you can make some kind of an image. The more light you have, for instance, your average Southern California sunny day with no clouds, you've got plenty of light, so you tend to be at the lowest ISO you can get away with, and you tend to have a cleaner image. With aperture, the artifact that we have to contend with there is depth of field. So depth of field, I have a graphic for it here in a minute, but depth of field, if you think of as it's just the area of the image that's in the sharpest critical focus. So when we have a wider aperture, which is the small f number, so something like f1.4, f2, f2.8, the depth of field is shallower. With a smaller aperture, which is the larger f number, so let's say something like f11, f16, f22, f32, and so on, you'll have more depth of field. So that means that the area that is in the sharpest critical focus is much larger. Here's a graphic. You guys should have seen this before. I've got this uploaded into Canvas. On the top, we've got a visualization of what narrow or shallow depth of field looks like. So if you compare these two situations where this hypothetical person is photographing a bear, in the top example, they're using a wide aperture, which would be a small f number, which gives shallow depth of field. So there's just a small area of the image that's in focus and the rest blurs out. In the bottom example, they're using a smaller aperture, which is a larger f number, which gives greater depth of field, so you can see that most of the scene is covered by that depth of field and it's in focus. And then lastly with shutter speed, the artifact that we have to contend with is obviously what happens to motion. So the faster the shutter speed, it's going to be sharper, more defined, and it's going to tend to freeze motion. With the slow shutter speed, it'll get progressively blurrier and blurrier. And that's all kind of relative to how fast your subject matter is moving, how close it is to the camera. So you could have something that's not moving very fast, but it's close to the camera, and it's going to exaggerate that motion, whereas you could have something that's moving incredibly fast, but if it's far away from the camera, it still might not feel like it's moving that much. So keep that in mind. So these are the three variables that we have to deal with. We can really use any combination of these. There's not necessarily a right or wrong one, but it depends on what we want our image to look like. What is most important to us? Are we most interested in a clean image with little noise in it, and we're not quite as interested in the particulars of how much depth of field we have or how much motion blur? Or maybe are we shooting subject matter that is moving and we're mainly interested in what the motion looks like? Or maybe it's something that we want the whole scene to be really, really sharp, so we know we want lots of depth of field, which would mean a small aperture. So those are the things that you need to think about. Let's talk about how this breaks down into when you're actually out shooting. What is your thought process like? So first, we tend to want to set the ISO first. With digital, I'll show you an example in a minute here. With ISO, digital noise tends to be kind of ugly, and when it comes to retouching that in Lightroom or Photoshop, there's tools that can deal with it, but sometimes it can be kind of a compromise. You can end up with noise that just compromises the image. So you tend to just set this as low as you can and only change it when you have to. So if I was going to go outside right now, it's afternoon, there's plenty of sun, I would probably set it to ISO 100, and only if I ran into a problem where maybe I was shooting something that was in the shade and I still wanted to keep a lot of depth of field, then maybe I might have a situation where I either need to go grab a tripod to put my camera on so I can get away with a long shutter speed, or maybe I'd have to raise the ISO. But in general, I want to try to set it as low as I can and just not really think about it. With film, you're going to tend to make that decision based more on the aesthetics. Film grain actually can be pretty attractive. So you might choose it based on, maybe you want a lot of grain. Maybe you want a really smooth, very fine grain, but it doesn't create the same kind of problems that you can have with digital noise. So we'll set our ISO. Then we decide. Notice right now, we haven't taken a shot yet. We're thinking through things. The next thing we'd have to think about is, okay, what else do we want out of this image? What does it need to look like? Do we want shallow depth of field? Do we want a lot? What do we want to happen with motion? So now we've kind of taken care of one variable. We set the ISO. Now we're down to two, and of those two, we're going to choose one to prioritize. So if I chose shallow depth of field, then I need to change the aperture, and I need to open my aperture to the widest that I can get away with if I want really shallow depth of field. So, for instance, one of my film cameras, I've got a lens that'll open up to f1.4, which is a really, really wide aperture and would give depth of field that's so shallow that it's in some cases almost too shallow. So if I wanted that little depth of field, then I would open my aperture to f1.4. If I wanted a lot, and let's say I was out shooting landscapes and I want the whole scene really sharp, then I would go the other direction. I would change my aperture to something like f16, f22, f32. If it's one of my large format cameras, some of those lenses can go to really tiny apertures, so I could take it down to f45, f64. If it was motion, then I might have to ask myself, okay, if I want frozen motion, then I need a fast shutter speed. So that might be something like 1/1000th of a second or 1/2000th of a second. If I want motion blur, let's say I'm shooting, I'm at the ocean, somewhere on the beach, or maybe Sunset Cliffs, and I want to make all the movement of the waves just look like a mist and really soft, then I would need a very long exposure. So I would want to set that first. Next, this is really one of the most important parts of shooting in manual mode, is you don't want to just go taking random guesses. We need help to figure out what is that third variable, what is that third setting, what does it need to be. We've already decided for ourselves the first two. We made a decision about ISO, we made a decision about, in this case, shutter speed. So then I need something to help me figure out the third one. In our ocean beach example, I chose ISO and I chose a shutter speed. So let's say a long shutter speed. Then I need something to help me figure out that last one. That's where your light meter comes in handy. When we get to the camera simulator, I'll show you what your light meter looks like. But this is a tool that's built into your camera, and it's going to just measure the amount of light based on whatever settings you input into the camera. And then it's going to tell you if it's too dark, if it's too light, and then you can change your settings and compensate until the light meter says that it's correct. And then lastly, we changed that last setting after having consulted the light meter.